Welcome again. It's Sunday morning to Bolt Like a Leopard. I'm just going to do a quick update. I've been off the air since, I believe, Thursday, and the most important story today, I believe, is not in the United States. There is the whole Puerto Rico story, which is really bizarre, with that mayor who's claiming that the federal government is screwing her country, and she's going on TV, doing whatever she can, wearing T-shirts, saying that they're not getting any help from the federal government. I don't think that's the most important story right now in the world. You have in Europe the Catalan referendum. I'm looking right now at The Guardian. And what's unique about this is that it shows a fault line on the left in Europe. And what I mean by that is that the left in Europe has to, it has to talk about what is really the, its position on Europe. I think that there's a pro-European left, and then there's an anti-European left, and it's pretty obvious in many countries where the left falls. In the United Kingdom, for example, there are plenty of people on the far left that see the European Union as a neoliberal institution, which it is, that sustains the corporate state. More people on the right, however, and the left-right is kind of fuzzy right now, but there's more people on the right at the moment that are starting to openly attack the European Union. On the left, it's kind of a divided issue. So why is that such a big issue in Spain? Well, you don't see it yet. I believe that the Catalonians, if you see my interview with Dr. Enric Llarch, I put it in the description already. If you see my interview with him, this is a person who's a strong Catalonian nationalist, but he is not in favor of leaving the European Union. And I think in the future this may change, and he kind of hinted at that. He said that in the context of international relations, just like everybody else, the Catalonian people will be governed by what was called during the Cold War realpolitik. I think that comes from German. What realpolitik means is that instead of having a policy based on ideological lines, a leader must accommodate his positions in order to suit the best interests of his country at the time. And I think it's a strategy that's worked for some countries. And I'll give one example. I know I don't want to nerd out on this and give it too much time because I do want to go do some other things today. But in the early to mid 70s, there was a chancellor of Germany. In Germany, they have a chancellor, not a prime minister or a president. They have a president, but he's in a symbolic role. So the chancellor is basically the prime minister of Germany, and they had one named Willy Brandt. And Willy Brandt was a staunch believer in seeking a peaceful settlement with East Germany. Now, he was also a social democrat. He believed in the welfare state, but he was not a socialist who wanted to tear down the capitalist state, or I'd say rather the capitalist industries in Germany. VW. You have Mercedes, you have Bosch, you have all those industries that turned Germany into an economic miracle in the 60s and 70s. He was seeking a third road, and he wanted to keep Germany, West Germany, within NATO with good relations with the USA, but he didn't want a war with East Germany. So what he would do is he would invite his East German counterparts for joint talks and cooperation. And it worked for a long time until there was a spy scandal because the East Germans had infiltrated his office. They had spies in his office. If you want to read a little about that time, which is a little too, it's a little too much detail already. There's a book called The Man Without a Face about Markus Wolf, who was one of the top East German spy chiefs. So what I'm saying here is that the Catalonians are now trying to vote for an exit from Spain. And for those of you that don't know, Spain is not this country that's uniformly quote unquote Spanish. There are regions of the country where there are far less Spanish speakers, and for example, the Basque country in the northwest is populated by the Basques, or Bascos in Spanish, VASCOS, and in English would be BASQUES. So the Basque country is populated by these people. They don't speak a language that's anything like it's not anything like anything. So they wanted to separate from Spain for years, and they've had a guerrilla war, a terror war, whatever you want to call it, against the Spanish government. And it's been generally let me see here. It's been generally cooled down in the past few years, but what we have is there's a live feed here from The Guardian. I can put it on, and I'm not a fan of The Guardian, but this is a leftist newspaper in the UK that's openly showing the whole procession of violence there. Okay, and this is what the senior EU politician Guy Verhofstadt, who is, well, let me present this to everyone. I don't know if you guys can see it. Guy Verhofstadt is a major EU politician. He said, "I don't want to interfere in the domestic issues of Spain, but I absolutely condemn what happened today in Catalonia. On one hand, the separatist parties went forward with a so-called referendum that was forbidden by the Constitutional Court, knowing all too well that only a minority would participate, as 60% of the Catalans are against separation. And on the other hand, even when based on court decisions, the use of disproportionate violence to stop this. In the European Union, we try to find solutions through political dialogue and with respect for the constitutional order as enshrined in the treaties, especially in Article 4. It's high time for de-escalation. Only a negotiated solution in which all political parties, including the opposition and the Catalan parliament, are involved, and with respect for the constitutional legal order of the country, is the way forward." So, according to the Catalan Health Ministry, 465 people have been injured as Catalans voted in an illegal referendum on the region's independence. The two most seriously injured are in hospitals in Barcelona. Although advocates stressed the right to political self-determination, the vote was banned by Spain's Constitutional Court, and millions of ballot papers were confiscated before the vote. Local and national authorities say 336 voting centers of more than 2,000 across the region have been closed by police. Voting has been marred by a brutal police crackdown. Videos show police hitting people in the crowd with batons while voters hold up their hands, police dragging voters from polling stations by their hair, and Spanish police attacking Catalan firefighters. The police action has been mostly confined to Barcelona, the Catalonian capital. There has been no police presence in the majority of voting stations throughout the regions. Polls have shown 70% of Catalans want to be able to vote in a referendum, but they are more evenly divided when it comes to independence. And then there's calls for the Spanish Prime Minister to resign. Human Rights Watch has released a statement calling on Spanish authorities to respect citizens' rights to peaceful assembly and refrain from using excessive force. And the Labour Party, the British Labour Party, has condemned the police violence. Emily Thornberry, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, said it is unacceptable for the Spanish authorities to overreact to today's events through aggressive police action and the forceful closure of police stations. And then the last bullet point here is not true anymore. The European Union is yet to make an official comment. So back to me. Like I said, for those of you that joined late, I do have an interview with a major, I don't know how major he is, but a professor from the University of Barcelona. It's in the description. You can go watch it. I mean, he's not really the most charismatic guy, but the truth of the matter is that Catalonia has for years been trying to separate from Spain, and now the European Union is going to be a complicating factor in it. And I'll explain why. The new look for the European Union is an attempt to create a United States of Europe, meaning that the nations that are in Europe will eventually become on the same on the same format as the states here in the U.S. They'll basically become completely submerged in a more regional nation state. There'll be sub-nations of a nation state, the nation of Europe. So just like we don't have an independent army in North Carolina. North Carolina has its National Guard. It might have state troopers. It does have certain bodies that are subordinate to it. But eventually, all of the European states, be they Italy and Croatia and France, will end up being basically appendages of the European Union, instead of the European Union being a union of them that is, that allows them wider latitude. And that's generally the reason that I think many people, not just in Europe, not just in Britain, but here in the United States, think that it's a horrible idea, because unlike Europe, we in the United States, who they're technically taking some of that format from, we don't believe that there's a long-standing difference in heritage between Pennsylvania and Kentucky, for example. There are certainly differences. There's different demographic patterns, but it's not as if Kentucky has a completely different culture and way of life that's different from Pennsylvania. I think there's much more commonality between the states in the United States than there are between the nations of Europe. Now, I could be wrong about that. I could be oversimplifying it. But the fact of the matter is that most secession attempts in the United States have, they've engendered a lot of opposition from the states trying to secede as well. That's not, obviously, the Civil War, for example, in the South. People know that there were plenty of people in the South who wanted the South to secede, mainly because of the issue of slavery, some say. Others say because of the issue of states' rights. But if that's the case, then what was tying together the states of Missouri and the state of North Carolina or the state of Louisiana? If it's only slavery, or if it's only the notion of states' rights, then I think that the Confederacy, if it would have succeeded in seceding, would have fallen apart itself. There's not much to keep it together if that was the case. Out on the bold, I'm not sure exactly what he's talking about there on the chat, but I'm not really going to be reading much of the chat today. Anyway, the Catalonian referendum, I think, will be the fault line on which the European Union begins to really fall apart, because if the European Union decides to commit to giving any ground to the Catalonians, then you're going to see a deep wave of fear passing through Spain when they realize that some of their other states might want to secede from Spain and become their own independent countries. And if the European Union says, well, those countries can join us too, then that causes an even larger wave throughout Europe. What the European Union essentially has said until now is that Europe will be a United States of Europe. So therefore, it shouldn't necessarily care how small those states are. It shouldn't necessarily care if, for example, Germany breaks up into some of its constituent states like Bavaria and I guess, what's another, I'm showing a little ignorance here, but Thuringia and Saxony. What's going to stop those states from breaking apart within Germany? It could theoretically happen. And Germany is not the worst case, and neither is Spain. Belgium, for example, has two constituent parts, a Flemish half in the north and the Wallonian half in the south, which is French-speaking. So we have a French-speaking and Dutch-speaking half. The only thing that keeps those together is a monarchy Okay, so there's a king that's the king of both of those realms, and the European Union, and that's about it. The unified Belgian identity is very weak. They also have a small German community in the east. So what that means is if the European Union is allowing these states to basically secede, then the middle level of government here, in this case between the seceding states and the European Union, is losing all its meaning. The people in Italy or in Spain or in the United Kingdom, remember they had a Scottish referendum, for example, they wanted to secede and join the EU. If those states secede, and then that means that the middle level, the nation level, doesn't really matter. That means that the United Kingdom doesn't really serve a purpose within the EU. That's one of the reasons I believe that people started to say, well, why do we need any participation in it? It's not really a democratic institution. The elections don't mean much because the elected EU members barely pass any laws that are reflective of public opinion. So I think that the case here, where you're going to see much more violence and less of a congenial result, will portend the end of the European Union. The European Union is based on the notion that these national identities are a thing of the past. That being a German and being Finn and being Croat and being an Italian are not as important as being a European. And I think that people know that it's not the case. I mean, there was the huge Greek debt crisis of the recent years. Well, the Greek debt crisis was partly a result of a major gulf in cultural spending identities between Greece and Germany. Greece is not an industrial powerhouse. They have a very small manufacturing base. A lot of their economy is based on agriculture and tourism, and that's just about as different from Germany as you can get. So I do believe that the European Union is based on a completely false reason for being, and I think it will be reflected. Now, Dr. Llarch, again, I encourage you, if you have the time, watch that interview. You get a little feel about what Catalonia is about. Dr. Llarch, I said to him, I'm fine with the referendum going forward. I think that it's not going to be the last one. And even though this is a progressive country, Catalonia, it's one of the more left-wing regions of Spain. I think that if we're really being consistent, we have to acknowledge that they have the right to leave Spain, and that's not really up to us. I think that if they become a self-governing socialist state, they'll quickly realize that some of the reasons that they seceded from Spain are not going to correct their own economic flaws. Then again, they could be successful if they follow some of the ideas of limiting immigration and really creating a fiscally responsible state. I don't see that necessarily their socialist model would fall apart. And that's all I have to say. I'm going to try to get those Dr. Llarch and his colleague Nuria to come back maybe one of these days. I don't know when. They're obviously pretty busy right now. But please check out that interview, and we'll get an update as soon as we can. Next issue, you have these protests in the NFL, and they are definitely going to show how they're breaking down. I think that they're not going to be going on very much longer for some of these teams. Today there was the New Orleans Saints against the Miami Dolphins. I believe that the Saints won that one pretty easily because the Dolphins didn't even show up. I have my Cowboys there. I think they're playing right now, which is where I'm going to be headed as soon as I can get to the gym. The Miami Dolphins lost 20-0 in London, and 3 of their players took the knee during the anthem, and both of the teams took the knee before the anthem. And what that whole protest of kneeling before the anthem and standing during it is the compromise that is the end of the protest as such. Let me pull up this article. So last week or the week before that, see, they had here we go. The week before last week, Keith Olbermann said that any white player not kneeling for the national anthem is supporting white supremacy. This Keith Olbermann is out of his fucking mind. The man is an unstable, schizophrenic moron now, and who goes on his GQ podcast and rants and foams at the mouth about anything that's going on. It has to mean that the Trump administration has become the ultimate embodiment of all evil. So he was saying that if you don't kneel for the anthem, that you're essentially a white supremacist or supporting white supremacism, which, you know, there's a small distinction there. Now you have Vox. Now watch, you should look at this, okay? It says, the NFL has officially whitewashed Colin Kaepernick's protest. The co-opting of protests against racism has a storied history in our country. And it said on August 28th, and it goes through the I Have a Dream speech and Bill Russell's reaction to it. Bill Russell, for those of you that are too young, was, I think he was an 11-time champion basketball player, center for the Boston Celtics. He's considered one of the top 10 players of all time if you include all of NBA history. And he called the I Have a Dream speech a mere picnic, a radical idea that had been compromised by organizers worried about appeasing then President Kennedy. So 54 years later, this story of activism compromise repeats itself. Last Sunday, in the largest single-day athlete protest in American history, players across the league linked arms and took a knee during the national anthem, but it was a toothless gesture. The demonstration, which started as a protest against police brutality by San Francisco 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick, had become a quote-unquote mere picnic. Now, I looked up the writer of this. This is I think he's a professor at Grand Valley State, Louis Moore. Last week's wave of protest was prompted by an angry rebuke by President Trump during a rally in Alabama. The president called for any son of a bitch who took a knee to be fired by the NFL. In response, players across the nation knelt in front of the flag during Sunday's games. But these protests meant something different. Billionaire team owners who had donated to Trump's campaign joined in. The symbol of taking a knee came to mean something else. Unity, anger toward Trump, free speech. Kaepernick's bold statement against systemic racism had been co-opted. The beauty and brilliance of Kaepernick's protest the previous season is that it put all athletes and fans on notice. I'm not going to stand up to show pride in a flag for a country that oppresses Black people and people of color, Kaepernick told reporters. He did not mince words. And his truth drew the ire of, this is why you see, like, they're obviously in the can for this bullshit. It says, and his truth drew the ire of white fans. For 2 minutes, they had to confront systemic racism and police brutality, something most fans don't want to acknowledge, especially during a football game. In short, Kaepernick took a page from Bill Russell's activist athlete playbook. As Russell noted in 1964, we have got to make the white population uncomfortable because that is the only way to get their attention. And, you know, it goes on to talk about his career. He was a very good and dignified civil rights advocate, going on freedom rides through the South. It says, but when Russell showed up at the march in Washington in 1960, the protest, which was originally planned as a labor movement to demand a federal jobs program to lift Black people out of poverty, had shifted to focus on civil rights only. Leaders agreed to abandon sit-in protests at the Capitol, settling for speeches instead. Freedom fighters in the southern trenches, like John Lewis, had to tone down the rhetoric. Oh, John Lewis, the great, St. John this guy who this year he became like the new martyr of the left. He toned down his rhetoric for President Kennedy, acquiescing to the demands of leaders, including King. Lewis changed his speech, although President Kennedy did not attend. So he toned down his rhetoric, and then the president didn't even attend. His presence was a key in whitewashing the event. How can his presence be key in whitewashing the event if he didn't attend? He wasn't even present. Organizers changed the program to accommodate him. Kennedy specifically asked activists to avoid protests and attacks on his administration. If he was going to put forth a civil rights bill, he did not want to be called out for his inaction on civil rights. The day's most memorable moment, MLK's I Have a Dream speech, was whitewashed. Instead of remembering his plea to end police brutality, his unifying dream of interracial harmony has become his legacy. This allowed Americans to evade the reality that King wanted more than just black and white kids sipping from the same water fountain. Among other demands, often for, gee, is that a hot? Real distracting this Bud Light ad. Too bad that they're basically advertising for brown water. He wanted an end to state violence against black people as he urged, we can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. I'm surprised Fox didn't, put like symbols instead of the word Negro. The same is happening with Colin Kaepernick's protest. The desire to appease adversaries has overshadowed the meaning of a protest against systemic racism. And then it goes through a lot of this other stuff, and it goes through the whole. They have like a martyr roll: Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, and Sandra Bland, calling it the systemic racism led to their deaths. I wouldn't say that systemic racism led to any of their deaths. I'd say that horrible decisions and poor government management and poor education led to their deaths. Okay, and that's with all due, and that's still blaming the system. That's not systemic racism, that's systemic incompetence. Being comfortable in their privilege, however, means that white fans have convinced themselves, like Pino from Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, that black players are somehow black, but they're not really black. They're more than black. Of course, we know that's not true. Just ask Steelers coach Mike Tomlin. Last Sunday, after Tomlin's team stayed in the locker room during the playing of the national anthem, they stayed in the locker because every player could not agree on one unified protest. The team was met with backlash from fans. The Pennsylvania fire chief called Tomlin the N-word. Others burned players' jerseys in anger. These fans want black athletes to shut up and play. Historically, the American sporting tradition has told black athletes to be content to shut up and play, to stick to sports. As Jackie Robinson once said, as long as the Negro is humble and submissive, he is approved by the majority group. But when he demands his rights, he is regarded by many as arrogant and a troublemaker. Robinson, Russell, Muhammad Ali, John Carlos, Tommy Smith, Craig Hodges, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Tina Charles, and Venus and Serena Williams, to name a few, are part of the cadre of athletes who did or do consistently speak truth to power during their careers. I don't see how Venus and Serena Williams, who have never faced, there's never been really any barrier to those two succeeding in sports. In fact, they've consistently succeeded with and blown away the competition. Serena Williams, I think, is considered now the greatest female tennis player ever. Most paid dearly for their activism. Robinson received death threats. Russell had his house defecated, and Ali lost 3 years of his career. Carlos and Smith were kicked out of the Olympics and struggled to find employment, and Hodges was blacklisted by the NBA. Fearing the retribution that comes with activism, most black athletes have shied away from activism. Their contribution to improving society, their reason, came on the playing field. As Willie Mays once said during the civil rights movement, reporters are asking me why I don't sit or demonstrate for civil rights. I try to make my contributions for racial harmony in the best way I know, on the baseball field. Kaepernick, in daring to take a stand, has lost his career. NFL owners are blacklisting him as punishment for making them and their fans uncomfortable. He is being punished for refusing to whitewash his message. This season, in support of Kaepernick, more NFL players have joined the protests, including for the first time white players. And this growing united front caught the attention of President Trump. Trump has turned the players' protests into a wedge issue. Oh, he turned it into a wedge issue. I didn't know that it wasn't a wedge issue before, that players were kneeling for the national anthem. This is part of an old playbook from the right to increase their support by attacking civil rights protesters. But in attacking players last weekend, the president, who uses his bully pulpit to simply be in the news, unwittingly changed the narrative of the protests. His attacks woke up a black labor force that had been placated by a long demand to shut up and play. After Trump's remarks, it was clear that the players would react. People suspected the protests would be a televised demonstration against police brutality. Players would kneel in defiance, and in doing so, by refusing to stick to sports, this would also be a shot at the owners who demanded their deference. But ahead of this past weekend's games, a number of the same owners who have likely colluded to keep Kaepernick out of their league joined the athletes in their protest. To be clear, although they went to the field and linked arms, owners like Jerry Jones, Dan Snyder, Arthur Blank, and Shahid Khan did not join the protest. They co-opted the protest and turned the day into a mere picnic. The protest that started out as a demonstration against systemic racism turned into a pacified demonstration for free speech, patriotism, and unity. What the owners are protesting is hard to tell. In their proclamations, these owners use the words like unity to explain their newfound passion for protests. Dan Snyder, the owner of the Washington football team, told reporters he joined the players to honor armed forces and bring unity. But unity is a false promise when you're donating $1 million to a misogynist who sides with white supremacists. That's cowardice. Now, I'm going to stop there for a second and tell you that this very paragraph that Vox did shows that they're also pussying out, because they called them the Washington football team. Now, that's a veiled knock against the Washington Redskins for their racist nickname. Now, but they didn't talk about that angle of it, because then they would have to confront the fact that players on a team that they know is using racist symbolism or protesting a totally different form of racism while unironically wearing the symbols of racism on their uniforms. Okay, and I'm not saying this because, I do support changing the nickname. I think, though, that it should be fully, it shouldn't be forced onto a team or onto the fans, okay? I don't have any problem with people, showing, and I think I just lost my audience, but I think that there's plenty of reasons that, you could object to that nickname, but you still have to acknowledge that forcing a law through that limits what nicknames can be used and what logos could be used is a new intrusion on the freedom of expression. All right, I have a guy on who's been commenting. I have no clue what he's talking about. Anyway, yeah, the Vox article, it starts to, so to summarize, you have this guy, his name is Louis Moore. He's associate professor of history at Grand Valley State University. It says, "We will win the day, the civil rights movement, the black athlete, and the quest for equality." I think that this is showing the end of the activist athlete as we know it, and I'll explain why. These people are calling Kaepernick to Jackie Robinson. No, that's absolutely not. That's not the case. Jackie Robinson had to fight through a society completely unwilling to contemplate that black and white players could play on the same team, could use the same facilities, that they even belonged in the same room or church or whatever. Today, that's not the consensus. Okay, like I said, there are people that think that, there are racists, but there's no objection nowadays to blacks praying in the same church, or using the same accommodations, or going to the same gyms, or doing anything or using the same bathrooms, or any of that. And this article openly says that that's not the issue. They're saying that the issue of civil rights, of the ability of ending segregation in schools and all public accommodations, shouldn't have been the issue in the civil rights era either. And think about that for a second. They were saying that the civil rights movement of Dr. King and various other leaders did not go far enough, which is, that they can make that argument. And there have been people even back in those days that made that argument, like James Baldwin, that they wanted a more radical black revolution. Some of them wanted a revolution that was much more politically radical. Baldwin and other activists were open communists. I think Harry Haywood, for example, was another one. That they believed in socialism or communism of one stripe or another. So that position has been around for decades. And what these people at Vox are saying is basically that they're outflanking the civil rights movement from the left, because they're claiming that this didn't really accomplish much. Well, then they're saying that Robinson himself didn't accomplish much, because the whole reason that Jackie Robinson is today considered an icon of American professional sports, regardless of what color you are, is because he was an amazing player. He had the grace and dignity of a few athletes of the time. Remember that Ty Cobb, who was just a horrible personality at some, to some degree, just a mean person, mean racist. He'd only been retired for a few years. This was basically the same generation that had rooted for Ty Cobb was still around for Jackie Robinson, and he had to deal with these protests, or not even protests. They were just outright insults and epithets thrown at him. He had to deal with that day in and day out. Colin Kaepernick is a player who he came into the league, and yeah, he did ride the bench for I think a year because Alex Smith was in front of him, he was still playing for the Niners. But when he got his chance, the team made him an icon. He was getting endorsements from, I think Beats by Dre was just one of them, but he had other endorsements. He had the whole Kaepernicking thing where you kiss your bicep and everything. There was never a wave of rejection for Colin Kaepernick that could in any way compare to what was going on with Jackie Robinson. And for these people to claim, oh, there's this direct tie and between the Kaepernick protest of the day and what Jackie Robinson did back in the 40s. There is no tie. First of all, Jackie Robinson was not a protester. He was not a protester. Yes, it was a statement of change and that he even played in Major League Baseball, but it wasn't protesting Major League Baseball. Jackie Robinson wasn't protesting racism in Major League Baseball. It's a huge difference. It's a huge difference. And for anybody to make that comparison, I think is just it's a distortion of history. It's a mockery of everything that story is about. And then when they say that the NFL owners co-opted the protest, well, this is where they automatically give in and they lose. This is where they lose their whole argument. Because just a week and a half ago, there were other people who were also on the side of the protest who were saying, well, they should. All the entire team should join in on the protest. Well, now the owners have joined in. Oh, now the protest has been co-opted. Well, which one is it? They can't win. And there's another reason they can't win. The teams that have protested, you had 3 players, I believe, on the Miami Dolphins protesting this morning in London. Once again, protesting on foreign soil. And then they lost the game 20-0. So the fans of the Miami Dolphins, who are they're recovering from a difficult time of hurricanes and power outages and recovery, and they may be trying to find a distraction. And their team, instead of playing in South Florida, which is could be understandable, there could be some damage to the stadium, but they're playing in London, so the fans can't even go to watch a damn game. So they're playing in London, and they have to see them doing this, kneeling during the anthem, and then losing 20-0. Now, I think that even some people that are, they understand the protest will now say that the Miami Dolphins are just a joke and that they should focus more on football. I think some people that have previously been for kneeling during the anthem are now going to start getting the point that it's a no-win situation, because when you protest and then you also lose, people stop paying attention to anything you're saying. Jackie Robinson was an all-star for many of his years, or at least he was an all-star quality athlete for many of his years in Major League Baseball. And he led the Dodgers to, I believe, their first World Series championship. It's not the same thing with Kaepernick, and many of these other players are, they're becoming the wedge issue here, and the wedge is going to pry them off too. And it's very easy to understand. Once your team starts to lose a lot of games and your season is meaningless. Here, I live in Ohio. We have 2 0-3 teams, the Cleveland Browns and the Cincinnati Bengals, going at it today. 2 0-3 teams. I think the Browns at least have protesters on their roster. If they lose today and they go to 0-4, how many people are going to be showing up to the game regardless of the protest? Nobody cares. If your team is losing anyway, then why do you even show up? Nobody cares about these protests. It's a charade. It's an illusion that people really care about them. People are showing up to watch a competitive contest, and the more that you muddy the waters with stuff that has nothing to do with it, that misses the point, that doesn't jive with their with why they even showed up for the game, the less success you're going to have. And the backlash has already happened. The backlash is as strong as it gets. And, I think that they're reaping what they sowed. So that's about it. I'm going to take off. Maybe we'll have another video later today. Hope you enjoyed it. Please comment, share below. Watch that Enric Llarch interview in the description for some more material on the Catalonia referendum, which I think is obviously more important than what's going on in the NFL today. And have a great Sunday, and we'll talk to you later.